Welcome to Book Reporter Talks To, where our guest today is Finola Austin, whose debut novel, Bronte's Mistress, I am just crazy about. I read this novel over a weekend. It's a debut that is so sharp, so well done. It's a book reporter bets on, and I'm so looking forward to sharing it with you. Now, I confess that I knew very little about the personal background of the Brontes before reading this, and I dare readers that once you read it, if you don't want to go right down the rabbit hole like I wanted to do, just to learn more. So I am looking forward to this conversation. Welcome, Finola. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and even more excited that you enjoyed the book.
Oh, completely. Absolutely, completely. So let's begin by your setting it up for our readers and telling us about Bronte's Mistress.
Yeah, so Bronte's Mistress is my debut novel. It's historical fiction based on a true story. So it's the story of Lydia Robinson, who was an unhappily married mother of five in the 1840s, whose life changed when Branwell Bronte, the Bronte sisters' dissolute brother, arrived at her house to be her son's tutor.
And when he got there, life completely changed. Life completely changed for her. At one point, Branwell says this about writing a novel. One must have a tale to tell, the tragedy, the great love story. And I have not found mine yet. But how soon did you know that you had a tale to tell with Bronte's Mistress?
Yeah, I think that's one of the few moments where I really identify with Branwell in the novel, actually. In my experience of wanting to be a writer when I was younger, I've always loved reading and books. It's a stereotype to say, but I always wanted to be a writer. Even as a very young child, I would make books out of paper and ask my mother to add the words. But as a teenager and young adult, I really did feel this lack of having something important to say. So I started a lot of projects and then set them aside. I felt like I was learning the craft, but I didn't have a burning story to tell. I did write another full-length novel before Bronte's Mistress, which I believed was the one. I did the whole querying process, tried to get an agent, and was disappointed as one by one all my requests came back as no's for various reasons. But when I came across the idea for Bronte's Mistress, it really was like being struck by lightning. I was reading Elizabeth Gaskell's biography of Charlotte Bronte, which was the first ever Bronte biography from 1857. And in there, she really completes a real character assassination of Lydia Robinson. She calls her this wretched and profligate woman who tempted Branwell into the deep disgrace of a deadly crime. She says it wasn't just Lydia Robinson's fault that Branwell died, but actually the deaths of the other Brontes, particularly Anne and Emily, could be blamed on her as well because they died of broken hearts after the loss of Branwell. And I just had to set the book down and immediately Googled to see, well, has anybody told Lydia Robinson's side of this story? And I was very struck that nobody had. I think we're seeing a moment in historical fiction where those stories of women who've been overlooked and ignored have really come to the forefront, and particularly the woman behind the great man. But what's so interesting here is Branwell Bronte was not a great man. He was a man who had three brilliant sisters. And so I was interested in the story of this woman who's been the villainess of the piece up till now, but has this connection with three of the most famous women writers in English literary history.
Yeah, and I just love that she corrupted him. I just love that the line was, she was the one that went and did this, blah, blah, blah.
Yes, in this case, the man became the victim, which is a huge statement coming from Elizabeth Gaskell, who has books like Ruth, where you see the 16-year-old virgin girl corrupted by the older man. So to twist that around and say this 43-year-old woman seduced this innocent 25-year-old, when we know Branwell was anything but. He'd already lost jobs because of his drinking problem. He was very much a man of the world. It just seemed so deeply unfair to me. And of course, there's a sexual double standard here in always blaming women for any sort of promiscuity or sexual affair.
Is when she goes running across the fields like half dressed to go find him, it's her fault. It has nothing to do with him. And he's just, the willing victim there. Oh, I've been so victimized by her.
I know. And of course, it's not like she can get divorced. So I understand that when people commit adultery today, we could say, well, why didn't you just leave? But that's not really an option for Lydia. She may be very privileged in a lot of ways. She's wealthy, she's white, she's beautiful. She has a beautiful estate to live in, servants to tend to her every need, but she has no property rights, no right to divorce. She can't vote. Her education has been extremely limited compared to her male peers. And what else can she do? And that was really the question I wanted to ask, and have people ask themselves. I think so often in historical fiction, people read it for some sort of wish fulfillment of how wonderful to live in this time of beautiful clothes and servants looking after you. But of course, there was a very, very dark side for this, especially for women. And what happens when at 43, you feel like your life is over, your husband's not having sex with you, and you have no other chance for happiness.
Yeah, and you definitely felt like that. And also, was it always your idea to write from her point of view? Because it's so strong in that first person narrative, because I felt like we were in her head the entire time in the book, from the times that she feels conflicted to the times she feels good about herself, both.
Yeah, so I think this novel could have been written a lot of ways, right? You could definitely go from Anne Bronte's perspective, because Anne was governess in the same house where Branwell was the tutor. You could also go from the perspective of one of Lydia's daughters. I think particularly her eldest daughter, who shares her name, Lydia. She has a pretty traditional arc for a historical fiction heroine. She makes some bold choices. She's 16 years old and, is at that moment where she's coming out in the world and trying to find her first love. So I could see a version of this novel that really sets her up as the heroine. But I always knew that it was Lydia's story I wanted to tell. From that very first moment when I read the Gaskell biography, I guess it tapped into something I'd been feeling for a while, especially about Charlotte Bronte, is that her heroines are often poor and plain and young and virginal. But Lydia Robinson was older, she was beautiful, she was wealthy, she was sexually experienced, she had 5 children, but wasn't her story worth telling too? And I'd always seen that, hostility within Charlotte Bronte's writing towards women who were attractive, women who were in a better position than her. Even the very first Charlotte Bronte novel I ever read, Jane Eyre, I felt for Blanche Ingram. Jane Eyre hates her. But why? Just because she's playing the game and doing what society asks of her, which is to find a husband. So that was very much the impetus, and to talk about not just the 19th century, but really it's my examination of feminism right up to today, and how there's an idea of the ideal feminist should be one way, and what if you don't fit that mold?
What if you're not there? What if you're not going on? Lydia is also saddled with a very difficult mother-in-law who is, and she's also coping when the book starts with the loss of her mother. And there's a lot of wearing of black. I mean, the way these people don the black clothes, and you can't go anyplace. I love when she tells her daughters, we can't go to that party, we're in mourning, and the daughters go stamping out of the room. So what you have is this very complicated woman right at the heart of it, because it's almost like I felt like she had nobody. She wasn't really close to her children, wasn't close to her husband. She was sort of like an island, I felt like, in the book, looking for a safe harbor. But she was like, just out there like, what can I do?
Yeah, and the first chapter actually opens with her coming back home from her mother's funeral. And the very first line, she's talking about that. She says that her husband's not waiting for her children are running down the driveway to meet her carriage. When she first meets Branwell, she says he's now more necessary to the operation of the house than she is. She's also resentful towards her housekeeper, who does a lot of the household management. So she doesn't really feel like she has a role, even though she's ostensibly the mistress. And I think the mother-in-law dynamic is one of the most interesting in the book. We hear a little bit about Lydia's the earlier years of her marriage. And what we hear is that the mother-in-law was there to start with, and it took years for Lydia to get her out of the house. And I think a lot of us can sympathize with that idea that she doesn't feel like mistress of her own home. She doesn't feel like she owns her own name. She doesn't even make the decision about which curtains to hang up in her room, because her mother-in-law takes control of that while she's still in bed recovering from the birth of her first child. And there's a bit later in the novel where she talks about the idea of, well, if men can be unmanned, can women be unwomaned? And this idea that her power within the home has always been taken away from her, whether that's by the mother-in-law or the governess who has more of the affection of her daughters, or the housekeeper who is making more of the decisions about the home. So I'm very interested in that dynamic, especially with how that interacts with motherhood. I think a lot of people who've had nannies or babysitters maybe can identify with that feeling of wondering, well, who do my children care about more, or do they even see me as the mother, or am I now superfluous here?
Yeah, and what is supposed to happen with me? There's a line where they're talking about adultery, where the woman who strays infects her husband. I love this line. Her home and all that come near her with her wanton deception. And Lydia snickers at this, wondering about men doing the same. And one can't help but think, she's so trapped. Like was she just a product of her days, or was her situation really different?
Yeah, I think in some ways Lydia is very much a product of her time. But I'm not meaning to suggest that every single woman was this unhappy. I think one of the reasons for Lydia's unhappiness is that she is a smart woman. And in one of the early chapters of the book, the first time she hears about Charlotte Bronte, Branwell tells her, "My sister Charlotte is the cleverest woman I know." And Lydia has this response of, "Was I clever? I'd never really considered it. My mother's called me beautiful. She said I was well-mannered, but am I clever?"
Mm-hmm.
And so she's at this moment in her life where she's asking, what else am I worth? She's always really prided herself on her looks. She's incredibly vain, but now her hair is turning gray, and it's not like she can just grab some hair dye. That's another thing that's blocked off from her. She's tried to be a very social animal. She talks about playing the pianoforte in order to impress the men, but she is actually incredibly musical, and she wants to play for herself. And time again in the novel, she tries to express herself through music, and men tell her to keep it down and be quiet, because what they want from her is essentially the 19th century equivalent of elevator music. So don't put too much passion into it. Don't put too much heart. And I think Lydia is so unhappy because she is clever. She does have the potential to do more, and she does have her own artistic leanings, which is one reason why she finds Branwell so irresistible, and the Brontes, especially Charlotte, so fascinating. They offer a different view of what a woman could be.
Yeah, because a woman was also, you were the childbearer. That's what you were. And so she had what were considered their three daughters, but they were considered not productive pregnancies because they did not produce a male heir. So she has her fourth child, he's the boy, and then she wants to have the fifth because she just wants the joy of having a child, almost with no responsibility. And then something happens to that child. And I thought it was so interesting because I hadn't thought that those other three children were sort of like ticking the wrong box for her. And she's achieved success, but then she wanted just something for fun. She wanted a child just for the joy of having one instead of what she was supposed to be doing.
Yes, and with the first three, she details what that feels like. For the first one, it's like, well, it's okay. You've proven you can have a live child. And by the second, it's more disappointing. And then with her third daughter, Mary, she says she was perfect in every way except for the most important. And I feel in that line, there's the tragedy of so many women who had so much potential in history. It's like, yes, you have everything else, but this fundamental thing that's going to set you aside for the rest of your life and allow you to be unable to achieve your goals. And so you're right, when she has the son, he's immediately whisked away from her. All the local farmers get a holiday while she's still resting up in bed, totally forgotten about because everyone's excited by the son. And her mother says to her, you need never have another baby, Lydia. You're done. Well done. You're out of here. And her response is, well, now I want a baby. I want a baby just for me. And that is Georgiana. And it's that child that she feels the greatest bond to. And it's that child that she feels actually shares her artistic temperament. So she talks about she was only a toddler, but she had these imaginary tea parties. She was musical. She could tap her fingers in time to the rhythm. So she sees herself as having things in common with her youngest daughter, whereas the traits she shares with her oldest daughters, she sees as purely negative.
Exactly. And then she also has the staff that we talked about before, where the staff is really in charge. And then all of a sudden she realizes there's so much holding her hostage because they know what's going on with her and Branwell, and they just hold it over her. And I was trying to picture the woman who is the housekeeper that's just like, well, now we need this and now we need that to keep your story straight. We saw you doing this. We saw you doing that. And I can just imagine her living in this world where you're under a microscope all day long of these people that are not, there's this false sense that they're trying to help you because they're really not. There's their job. And you're not sitting there saying, oh, we just want you to be happy all day long. That's their job. Their job is to do this all day long. And if there's a chance they can take you down, they're going for it. And they did with her.
Yes, and Miss Sewell is that housekeeper character. Lydia sees her as an upstart. She's pretty young to be being a housekeeper. And I should just say that all the characters in this novel are based on real people. And that was really important for me, that I knew more about the servants than Lydia does. So there's a moment, for instance, when one servant says to her, I've got 5 children, ma'am. when I know all those children's names, I know the backstory. Lydia, of course, doesn't think it's, worthy of her notice, but it really helped me build up a picture of what matters to them. And with the housekeeper, she, of course, wants to find a man. She wants to get married. She wants to move up in the world. It's not her aspiration to be Lydia's housekeeper for the rest of her life. I will say there's one exception on the servants, which is the lady's maid, Anne Marshall. So you mentioned how Lydia really has nobody. I think Marshall is the closest she has to somebody. But that relationship is particularly an interesting one for me because women had such a high level of intimacy with their ladies' maids. This woman dresses her and undresses her every day because Lydia can't even properly get in and out of her clothes without help because of restrictive Victorian fashions. Anne Marshall also bathes her. She washes her hair. We have references to that. She empties her chamber pots, references to that. She would be the person washing her menstrual rags. She knows her on a level that it's very hard for us to imagine today, where we just get more privacy because of the hygiene and the facilities made available to us, as well as the less restrictive clothing. But her relationship with Marshall is pretty complicated. There are moments where it seems to have a romantic or sexual subtext as well. There are moments where Lydia seems almost attracted to Marshall one second and then repulsed by her. She slaps away her hand once, but then she grabs it and kisses it, which for her is incredibly affectionate. But at the same time, she's noticing that it's a red chafed hand, not a lady's hand. And there is a moment with her and Marshall later when Marshall goes to leave her, where Lydia thinks to herself, was I wrong? Was there nothing more than a relationship between a lady and her maid between us? And the tragedy is she can never know, and we don't know either. Is Marshall just playing the role of the dutiful lady's maid? Or is it possible that she has affection for Lydia or even romantic feelings for her as well? So that was something I definitely wanted to suggest in there. And I'm fascinated by that particular dynamic because there is such an innate closeness to it.
Yeah, and she is the one person, I would agree that when I was reading, she was the one that was bonded to her the most. She was on her side at every single moment. She would listen to her moaning about things. Oh, yes, ma'am. Oh, yes. Oh, you look wonderful. You look beautiful. All these kinds of things. But that moment where she says she's leaving, you can just picture Lydia going, no, you can't. Because it was like the anchor of her life was the person that was leaving her. And it becomes so difficult as a result.
And the person who you maybe take for granted because they're so reliable, right? And we see that with Lydia, that she's always running after the next big thing and maybe not seeing what she has right in front of her.
Yeah, exactly what's going on. Your character of Dr. Crosby keeps his own secrets, as well as those of his patients. There was really a Dr. Crosby as well, correct? And did you come upon him early in your research, or was that later on?
So Dr. Crosby is really interesting. He comes up in Bronte academics and biographers sketching of this affair because he did act as some sort of go-between between Lydia Robinson and Branwell once Branwell had left the house. So he appears to have passed letters, potentially money too. And so he's had a really bad reputation amongst Bronte studies. So I've seen suggestions, oh, he must have been in love with Lydia as well. The most charitable I've seen is, well, he was also seduced by this terrible femme fatale. But when I started to look into Dr. Crosby in my research, he was very well regarded in the area. I went to the villages of Great and Little Usman, near where Lydia's house stood, and his is the largest obelisk and memorial in the church in Great Usman. So even today, the villagers there know who Dr. John Crosby was because he's so prominently displayed in the church. And he was just beloved by local people. They raised money to hook up this memorial when he died pretty shortly after my novel is set, actually. He was also widowed extremely young, but he chose never to remarry, and he certainly had the money to do so because he seems to have been supporting several of his siblings and their children. And so I didn't want any sort of suggestion of a romantic relationship between him and Lydia. I wanted Lydia to have a friend as well who wasn't just her lady's maid, and Dr. Crosby seemed to be a great candidate for that. He also had further connections to Branwell. He seems to have been a Freemason, as Branwell was as well. So that kind of gave me another line of connection between them. And so, yes, the secrets I gave Dr. Crosby were really to ensure that the relationship he and Lydia have is purely platonic. I will say that he shares this confidence with her really to make her feel better about what she's just confided in him. And her reaction is a little bit less than sympathetic. It's sort of a, well, you don't need to repeat it. We never need to mention it again. So again, Lydia's acting like a person of her time, and she's certainly not a woke historical fiction heroine.
But she also didn't tisk tisk. She's like, okay, we'll just won't discuss that again. Like,
Yeah.
it's more like, not, oh, I can't believe I was right. Well, we'll just move on. We'll just move on from that topic. I just love the way she did that. It's like, okay, whatever. So for your research, did you spend a lot of time, well, okay, you spent a lot of time reading background. How about boots on the ground, going over to England?
Yeah, so I did a full year of research before I started writing, and I started with secondary sources, so the biographies, academic articles, any article that had ever been written about the Brontes that mentioned Lydia Robinson, and then I went to primary sources from that, so looking at their endnotes. There's an amazing document, which is 4 diaries that a local man named George Whitehead, he was a carpenter, kept of births, deaths, marriages, and sundries just in that area. And so one thing I did was I used the census records to find the servants' names, and then I cross-referenced those servants' names with the index in these diaries, which local historians raised money to publish in 1990. So I was able to buy a secondhand book online. So this was the kind of detailed desk research I did. I then wrote the novel, and it was only when I had a draft of the novel that I went on the research trip. The research trip was the most fun I had writing this entire thing. I only spent 5 days because I live and work in the US, and anytime I go back to the UK, I need to see my family there. But it was the most packed 5 days imaginable. So I first went to Great and Little Usbin, the area where Lydia lived. The house no longer stands, but the house where Branwell slept, the monk's lodge, which I described, does. So those details about actually having a monk statuette above the door, that's all true. I had to change things. At one point, I had him climb out of the window. Then I saw the windows, definitely too small to climb out of as a grown man. So things shifted like that on a detail level. The school that now stands on the site of Fort Greenhorn, Queen Ethelburga's Collegiate, now forms the prologue of the novel, which starts with this newspaper clipping. So that was actually born out of the wonderful janitorial staff there let me into their closets to dig through old paperwork. And I didn't find any forgotten Bronte manuscript, unfortunately, though I did find a lot of early documents related to the school, old photographs from the 20s and 30s, etc. But I imagined, what if this manuscript by Lydia just happened to be in this school storage room? So that's now how the whole book starts. I saw the graves of lots of the characters, as I mentioned, Dr. Crosby's, but also Georgiana's, Lydia's husband, Lydia's son, Ned, as well, who was the one Branwell was tutoring. That was pretty emotional for me because I'd been living with these people a year and a half, and it really brought home to me how real they were. And then after being in that area, I went to Haworth, to the Bronte Parsonage Museum. I did archival research. They have a set of papers called the Robinson Papers, which is everything related to the house. So legal documents like Edmund's will, which is mentioned. There are 18 letters from Lydia. They're just business letters, but actually I'd seen one of them quoted before, which is what gave me the idea for the animosity between her and the mother-in-law, because there's a note where it says, Bessie says that Grandmama is exceedingly angry about something. And so that was really the catalyst for that whole relationship. I also took Lydia's signature from the real letters. So she always signs off yours very truly, which is how she signed off in real life. And there was a wonderful inventory of all the furniture in the house. So if a piece of furniture is mentioned, it probably is from that inventory. So at one point, my agent and editor and I were out for dinner, and one of them said, there's a lot of mahogany, isn't there? And I said, well, it is, there was. Like,
that's what the wood was. That's what they were using.
Like mahogany table, mahogany side table, mahogany mirror, like it's all in there again and again. So those were the kind of wonderful details that I could then go back, and when I was doing the next draft of the novel, layer in. I also can't drive, which is difficult for a research trip, but was kind of beneficial in a way because I did everything on foot. So not only did I walk across the moors, living my best Bronte sister life, but in the Usbins, I walked the distance between where the house is and where the villages are, which is much more akin to how you would travel around in the 19th century. Though I had amazingly good weather. So another note I had when doing edits was that the weather was too good for Yorkshire, which was partly my response to having been there in the most glorious week of sunshine in April. I'd gone prepared for total rain, and I actually overheated at one point because of running around too much with no water.
Yeah, I've been places where it was like a really nice weekend and they go, it's never like this. We want you to know that it's never really like this. So I could picture them coming back going, it should have rained, but it didn't. The whole time I was there, it's not, didn't work out.
Absolutely.
Did you find it was difficult after you'd done the research to edit down, like as you were writing, because you had so many wonderful details, to decide what to keep and what should go?
Yeah, so my writers group were a help to me on this. My biggest problem, it sounds ridiculous, but I had too many Williams and too many Anns. And I just had a lot of repeat names because they were not the most innovative when it came to naming their children. So even Lydia herself, she is Lydia Robinson, née Gisborne. Her oldest daughter is Lydia Mary Robinson. Her middle daughter is Elizabeth Lydia Robinson, and her youngest daughter is Mary Lydia Robinson. Both her sister and her sister-in-law are Marys. She has a William who's her coachman. She has a William who's her brother-in-law. It just got terrible. And I started to distinguish by, sometimes there are people who are more Will than William, for instance, or Anne Marshall is an Anne, and then we have Anne Bronte and another maid, Anne Ellis. So I just had Marshall be more often referred to as Marshall. And Ellis is often referred to as Ellis, even though she probably would have been Anne given her rank. But I did cut out some Williams and Annes. So I slimmed down the household size in that there were of our servants at the house. I just concentrated on the most important, the Sewells and Marshall and Ellis, which was a shame. So I just ended up taking out some little references when it was there to confuse. Another thing I did was have the characters get confused sometimes. So there's a couple of times where people say Lydia, and Lydia is not sure whether they're referring to her or her daughter, because that just naturally happens. As anyone who's been a place with several Matthews will know, nowadays this happens to us as well. But I really had to hang a flag on it and listen to the feedback about when it was very confusing, which was good for my writers group. So that was a big thing. There was also stuff that I just dug into and researched a lot that didn't really, end up getting that much page time. So for instance, there's one reference to the York Medical Society, which a couple of different doctors mentioned were members of. I actually ended up talking to the Bovwick Institute in York and getting them to pull out the records of that medical society for me and look for references to Dr. Crosby and the others. There was nothing of interest in there that I really ended up incorporating, but it was an avenue of investigation I was happy to go down. Similarly, there's a curate that's mentioned a few times, Kirk Greenhorn. I have mentions to maybe Anne having a soft spot for him, although he's married. He actually wrote his own poetry, which I was able to dig up. I spoke to Poppleton Library, which had some access to those manuscripts. And I mentioned that in my author's note, but there wasn't much opportunity to really incorporate much of that or some of the details that I got. So I just had a richer world than what ended up on the page. But I think having that context and me knowing it brought some richness to the novel, even when I couldn't cram in every single detail. Yeah, similarly, if I'd had more time, on my trip, I would have gone to Scarborough, which is an important location in the novel, to Great Bar Hall, Sir Edward's house, which still stands, which becomes very important later in the book, and to Alstree Hall, where her sister and brother-in-law lived. But I actually had to rely on Google Maps, on people's images, and on an amazing subgenre of YouTube video, which I found, where people break in and trespass to old abandoned houses in England and film themselves. So Great Bar Hall is a shell, the insides are in ruins, but thanks to some very reckless men with GoPros on their heads, I did see the interior or what was left of it.
I love it. I love it. So there are all these little nuances, but if you can just get mahogany, or you could just get one little thing out of those, it was worth it to go down that little rabbit hole and see what was going on.
Really?
You use letters in the book, which are a perfect device, because what they do is they take the readers away from it just being Lydia's story. They take it away to a different, and it's just a story of women. And they also help fill in the details that might otherwise bog down the text. It's like, let's just move this whole thing along. Were the letters there from the beginning, or were they something you added later on?
Not from the very beginning. Actually, the first letters come, I think, after 100 pages or so.
Mm-hmm.
So they actually don't start to come in till later. And part of their role is to accelerate the pace of what happens across the story, right? I think we need more time to be fully immersed in Lydia at the beginning to get to know her and her world. But as with any novel, it kind of, the pace picks up as it moves on and the plot is set into motion. When you're writing about real people, sometimes things are really annoying. So sometimes it's like, well, it's a 5-year period. And if I was just making this up, maybe I would cram it into a 3-year period.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to really think about when I was going to time jump, and the letters helped bridge those gaps. The other things that the letters did was allow me to have some other people's voices come in a little bit, even though the main text is entirely in Lydia's point of view. So we have Branwell's ranting and raving, and while none of the letters are real, the poems he incorporates are real. All the poetry I include is Branwell Bronte's. I think it's pretty bad. I've had several critique partners and writers groups ask me that question when I was writing this of, did you write these poems? And every time I said no, people were relieved and said, oh, thank goodness, I can tell you how bad I thought they were then. So I loved having a vehicle to include some of those. I also think it's important to have the perspectives of people who are critical towards Lydia. So there are some vitriolic notes from the evil mother-in-law, and I really loved getting into her point of view and perspective. And on that, I actually had a pretty unusual thing I did for research on the mother-in-law, which is I spent time on Reddit, and in particular, there's a forum on Reddit called Just Know MIL, so Just Know Mother-in-law. And all day, every day, it's just women ranting about the crazy things their awful mothers-in-law do. And I don't have a mother-in-law, and anyone I've ever dated, I've liked their mother. But just seeing what the patterns were of this pretty obsessive behavior of women who are maybe a little overly close to their adult sons was incredibly beneficial for me in building up the picture of who this woman could be. And I hope it rings true. She's certainly a monster-in-law, but I came across worse stories on that subreddit. So yeah, the letters give us a little insight into her as well.
Yeah, and I just like, well, I must come. And they're like, no, please don't come. And also her daughters really don't like their mother. I mean, there are just so many times where I don't want to do this. I'd much rather go be with grandmother. I'd much rather go back with Aunt so-and-so. I don't want to be with you. And she gets pushed aside by these children just as much as she's getting pushed aside by the mother-in-law in a different way. You know, I will be there tomorrow, and you're like, please don't come. And then the kids are like, oh, we would much rather be with them than with you, which doesn't do anything to her self-esteem or her feeling good about herself.
Yes, I think Lydia's relationship with her daughters is really interesting. One, they are teenagers as the novel starts. So there's 3 of them, they're like 16 and 16, 15, and 14 when it starts. So a notoriously difficult age. And I think some of what they do and say could easily be interpreted as just purely teenage behavior. So when they don't seem very upset by the death of their other grandmother, Lydia's mother, and upset that their plans are canceled, I think there are probably teenagers today who have similar reactions to deaths in the family or family obligations. But there is true that there is a division between Lydia and her daughters that I think goes beyond that. She mentions a couple of times that she's essentially keeping them at arm's length because she feels that the death of her youngest daughter was in some way caused by her loving her too much. So this idea that I loved her so well that God took her away from me. And she was almost kind of pushing the other daughters aside to protect them or to protect herself from future hurt. She also really believes in tough love. So she mentions a lot her own mother and says, well, this is what my mother taught me, and this is how she looked after me. And a particular area for that is in body image and with her second daughter, Bessie's weight. So Bessie does not seem to be overweight, certainly by our standards. She's a very athletic girl. She likes going to the stables, hanging around with the groomsmen, being on horseback. She's certainly not very ladylike, and in that she might remind readers of Agnes Grey, of the second daughter Matilda in the Murray family, which was said to be based on the Robinsons. But Lydia is very concerned about this, and her concern comes from a place of love for her daughter because she wants her to be able to get married. It's the only way for her to survive in the world as far as Lydia is concerned. And so she slaps her hand away from the butter. She makes mean comments about her weight. She brags about her own waist size and how small it was when she was younger. And I think a lot of people can see that as very harsh. And yet I know so many women today whose mothers have acted similarly, who have pushed their own insecurities about their bodies onto their daughters. And I really saw Lydia as trapped in that cycle and doing unto her daughters what's being done unto her. And there's a moment towards the very end of the novel where she says to Bessie, her second daughter, what would you have me do? Change the world and your place in it? And I think as a reader, we could be yelling at the page and saying, that's exactly what I'd have you do. Go and fight, demand the vote, say this is wrong. But you know what? Most women didn't. Most oppressed people don't. Most people just try and survive, and they don't fight against the establishment. And that's the kind of story I wanted to tell, of someone who's not a revolutionary thinker and doesn't imagine that the world could be a better place.
She just sees that this is the way it is. This is the way things are. This is what they're doing.
Yeah, she's pragmatic to a fault.
Absolutely to a fault. So it is also surprising to me, though, with all this post going back and forth, how quickly the mail moves. I mean, here it's like, snail's pace. There it was like, quick as a button. You know what I mean? Back and forth with the mail. So
penny post, I mean, is the main form of communication, right? Like, and I have letters in here that are long, but I also have 1 and 2 sentence letters that are dashed off very quickly. And there's a moment with her and her older sister, her much older sister, who she hasn't really seen in years. They only communicate through letters. And then when they see each other, they find that they don't actually have much of a relationship. And I'm very interested in that, in how the communication we have over text or over screen gives us the illusion of intimacy, when in person, that person might not be who you believe they are. And especially at this time where we're living our entire realities digitally, I'm interested in how that plays out when we are back in the real world side by side. And I think that's what Lydia finds when she's finally at Ulster Hall with her sister.
When she's finally there, and it's not just on paper, and they are comparing each other's lives. There's so much competition between Lydia and her sister. And then Lydia, well, then I'm going to leave here because you're not treating me the way I want to be treated. And I'm going to go to this other place and I will be better than you. And it's this very big competitive edge going back and forth between them.
And with her relationship with any women, right? Even the fact she feels like she's competing with her housekeeper for control of the house, or competing with Anne Bronte for the affection of the children, or competing with Charlotte, someone she's never met, about who's the cleverest. She says, I don't know why, but it struck me as a rebuke. So to hear another woman complimented by Branwell makes her feel worse about herself. And with Dr. Crosby again, especially when she finds out his secret, she says, like, no wonder there'd never been any insidious competition between us. But the competition is entirely coming from her. She could choose to embrace several women, to see their choices as different from hers, but not a threat. But I think we still see this playing out today. And one really interesting thing that's happened to me in writing this novel is I'm not a parent, but I've had my own personal preview of the mom shaming that goes on and the judgment that people have about other people's parenting skills. So I've had, people say Lydia's a terrible mother, and I've heard a lot of criticism, and I agree that she's not kind of acting by any 2020 parenting book, but parenting wasn't even a verb till the late 20th century. She doesn't see children as needing to be coddled and protected. But something that only crystallized for me recently is that nobody ever asked me why Edmund is such a bad father. And we never see him interact with the children. He tells them to be quiet once, I think. And yet every question I have on parenting in the book is about her failings as a mother. And he's given a free pass for being not very involved with the children. And she's involved, even if we might not like what she has to say.
And she's still overseeing what's happening. I mean, he basically assigns the tutor to the son, not knowing he's going to assign it to the wife as well, but he assigns a tutor to the son, and that's basically what he feels that's what he needs to do.
Yes.
You have a popular blog called The Secret Victorianist. Did I have it right? Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
So what spurred you to create that? So, because that was before you started writing.
Well, yes, I've always written, but it was definitely before I started writing this book. I did a master's in 19th century literature, and I graduated from that in 2013. And started working in my career in advertising and marketing, which is still what I do during the day now. But I decided to start a blog on the side because I had all these academic essays I'd written while at Oxford that I wanted to share with the world. And I didn't want to be an academic because I think the further you advance in academia, the fewer people know what the hell you're talking about. And you get to a point where maybe there's only 1 or 2 other people qualified enough in the world to read one of your essays and fully understand it. And I've always wanted to write stuff that touches more people, whether that's in the context of my marketing job or in the context of writing creatively. So I started cutting down chunks out of my essays as more digestible chunks of information and putting up blog posts, especially on the more obscure Victorian novels that I'd read as part of that master's, which was great. I didn't have a huge following, but the people who I was engaged with were Victorian superfans like me. They introduced me to a lot of other bizarre Victorian books I hadn't come across. And since 2013, I expanded the scope essentially. So it started off as more academic in tone, but I read more and more historical fiction. I have a series called Neo-Victorian Voices, where my criteria are, it has to be set in the 19th century, but written in the 21st century. So that's part of the canon I see myself as part of now. I also would review plays set in the 19th century or art exhibitions with paintings for the period. So it's just a place for me to record my hobby. I think the side effects of this was, one, it got me writing regularly and getting past perfectionism, because if you're trying to blog once a week or 3 times a month, then you need to just get it done and get it out there and not worry about every single word. And then of course it did connect me to other people with interest in this area. So after I did write this novel and sell it, I gradually started merging my identities. I named the blog The Secret Victorianist because when I started it, my identity was not on there. I thought it would be very embarrassing as someone who was trying to start a career in advertising to have a blog with all of 10 followers or whatever it was at the beginning. And so in the years since then, I started to become more public about being the Secret Victorianist. And now it's my blog, whereas, you know, it's connected to the rest of my identity. And of course, I'm using it to talk about Bronte's Mistress as well.
Do you wish you were born during that time?
Absolutely not. I mean, poor Lydia, right? I mentioned that I think a lot of historical fiction is wish fulfillment, and I think that's fine. I know a lot of covers in the genre have the woman's back, right? So you can't see her face, and I think that's partly so we can imagine ourselves in that scenario, whether it's in a beautiful ball gown coming out as a debutante, or whether it's fighting against Nazis as a member of the French resistance. You know, it's an exciting life and an exciting world, and something a lot of us maybe would daydream about. But I absolutely did not want that for my cover, because Lydia's story is not a story of wish fulfillment. It's a story of the reality. And so it's never a reason I wanted part of her face visible. I also didn't want to decapitate her like we see on a lot of women on movie posters, where it's really objectifying them and their body versus concentrating on them as a living, thinking, feeling person. So no, I think I would do very badly in the 19th century, and I don't know in what form my rebellion would take, but it's more likely to be of the reckless sort of running around with Branwell versus the positive sort of changing the world and marching for the vote.
So there we go. There we go. Was the title always Bronte's Mistress?
No, when I was writing it, it was always Lydia. Because I didn't think too much about it. I just knew it was going to be her story, her perspective, and I knew she saw herself as Lydia, not as Mrs. Robinson, though the potential that this was actually the inspiration for The Graduate and Charles Webb is absolutely tantalizing to me. So
I was wondering about that. Because Robinson, is that really where the inspiration came from?
a lot of people believe so. So
Wow.
Charles Webb wrote The Graduate, and the main male character in that is Benjamin Braddock. So he shares the initials BB with Branwell Bronte. Charles Webb himself never confirmed this, and he actually just passed away this last June, but he was very much anti-establishment, and he hated the success of the book. He gave away his earnings from it. He said he felt haunted by it. His son, who was a performance artist, actually ate a copy of it once with cranberry sauce, to his father's utter delight, for an art performance. So he never wanted to speak about it publicly, but it seems likely to me, with the BB and the Mrs. Robinson, that he was thinking about this scandal. But yes, on the title, so it was always Lydia. And then when I started thinking about trying to get an agent, I knew it had to change, because I didn't think Lydia was distinctive enough, and I knew that the Bronte connection was my hook. So I had whole documents where I tried to spitball different names. I definitely didn't want Branwell to get equal billings. This was never going to be Mr. Bronte and Mrs. Robinson, or Branwell and Lydia. But I struggled with how to get the Brontes in here. And then I came across Bronte's Mistress, and I thought, well, this is great, because you have the intrigue of which Bronte, because you don't say which one, but it still centers her. And for mistress, obviously there's a sexual connotation, but for me, the primary meaning is the female equivalent of master. Is she the mistress of the relationship, the mistress of the house? She's the one very much in charge. So it was Bronte's Mistress when I got the agent. And then my agent, one of her first questions for me was, have you ever considered just naming it Lydia? So of course I laughed. We talked about all of the same things. And again, when we went on submission to the publisher, we spoke about it and we thought, well, the publisher and the editor we want needs to be inspired by the Bronte hook. So we thought, we'll leave it as Bronte's Mistress. And then my very first call with my editor, before she made the offer, that was her first question, was, have you ever considered just using the title Lydia? And I just laughed and laughed. So we talked about, is it going to be Lydia, a novel of the Brontes, or have some sort of subtitle? It went right down to, you know, being discussed by marketing and publicity departments as well as editorially. I think we made the right decision to do Bronte's Mistress by the end, but it's just so funny that everyone has had the same instinct about it, as like, this is very much about Lydia. It's her story. It's not about Branwell. Like, he's certainly an important character, but he's a secondary character. And the Bronte connection makes this, you know, attractive to other English majors and people who love the literature of the 19th century. But it's not just a book that gave me an excuse to write about the Brontes. I was more interested in Lydia and herself.
Lydia herself and what she did. So which Bronte novel did you read first? Which was your first, your gateway?
Jane Eyre was the first one. And I think it was actually read to me by my mother. She used to read to us when we were in bed. So I read it very, very young. And then through my teens, I read all of the rest of them. Wuthering Heights, I studied in school. The poetry probably a little bit later. I remember dabbling in some juvenilia in my teens as well. And I certainly read, the first Bronte biography I read was Dark Quartet, which I read at some point in my teens.
Is there a favorite? Is there one that you say, oh, if you're going to start here, this is my favorite?
I think probably still Jane Eyre as the classic place to start. I think maybe Villette is a better novel, but it's so hard. I oscillate so much. I think Anne is very unfairly overlooked, and I think Tenant of Wildfell Hall was pretty revolutionary. And I think Agnes Grey is such an interesting book because it almost feels more similar to Jane Austen. It doesn't feel particularly Bronte-esque, but there's a comedy and a social commentary in Anne, and she's very observational in a way where Charlotte and Emily seem so caught up in their passions and their characters' passions that they don't seem great observers of social niceties.
Don't look at those things quite the same way at all. So are you working on anything new now?
I am. So I can't say too much about it, but it's also historical fiction. It's also about a real person with other real characters in it, but it's a different time period and a different country. So not all my research has been in English, which has been upping a difficulty level, but hopefully I'll have more to share about that soon.
I think you would be up for the challenge. Just from the little conversation I've had with you, oh, let's not do it in English this time. Let's try something else. I could see it.
Thank you. I mean, it's just, I was so immersed in the Victorian period because of my academic background. So it was more challenging to, you know, have to go to a time period where I had less of that grounding and, you know, discover a whole new world. It's been brilliant.
You know, it's funny when you were saying before about, you know, The Graduate was an influence. The song Mrs. Robinson was not Mrs. Robinson. It was there were different three syllables. And they were sitting there in a meeting and they said, well, do you have a song? And they were, well, we've got this one. And they go, just change it to Robinson. And we have the song that we could absolutely use. So I always think of that when I was reading the book. I was like, wait a second, The Graduate layered in, totally see it.
Yes.
Be glad she had that name, 3 syllables.
A lot of writers have like playlists. I don't really listen to music, certainly not music with lyrics while writing, maybe sometimes just orchestral music. But all I've got on the playlist is Mrs. Robinson and Kate Bush, Wuthering Heights. There's nothing else I think is appropriate.
There's nothing else that's really going to work. If I can see this being a book that book groups would love to talk to you about, is there a way that book groups can get in touch with you if they want to have you join the discussion?
Yes, I would love to do that. I've already got a couple set up, but I would love to do more. So just go to my website, www.finolaaustin.com, and use the contact form there. I'm also all over social media, as you would expect from that being my day job. So I'm really would love people to get in touch. And yeah, I'd love to hear what people think about Lydia. I think she's a character who deserves to be debated over some wine.
I also want to remind everyone who is going to send her that note, put what time zone you're in and what time zone you're in, when your group meets, day of the week, things like this. It will save a lot of going back and forth with the author. Because a lot of times people go, do you want to come to my book group? And it's like, and can you give me a little bit more description? So especially the time zone, because what we find a lot is everybody thinks their time zone is the time zone, and it's not.
That's certainly very true. And I think especially those of us in New York are guilty of this. So I've got a lot better, even just professionally during this lockdown period with, you know, specifying the time for everybody. I think what's nice about right now is that the author won't be the only one dialing in remotely necessarily, because a lot of groups are meeting purely digitally. So I think this is a really lovely time to kind of jump in and get involved and chat to people.
I think it's actually helped. We're actually doing a survey on our reading group guide site right now. And I'm asking people to weigh in of, have you shifted to Zoom? Because I think it's much easier to have a conversation with an author if you are already familiar with technology, of what you would be able to do. And what are you using and how have you pivoted? And the results have been very, very interesting. I think also being able to be in your home and meet with people all over the country is so much easier these days. I mean, you're probably on tour from your home, able to go to a much larger group than you would have been with just a physical tour. Yes, and I've been enjoying that so much. I'm catching an event just about every night. There's something to watch.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. And not just all over the country, right? Like I'm half Irish, half English, so I'm super happy to chat to people in Europe as well. Asia is always more challenging because it needs to be super late or super early for somebody, but certainly open to speaking to people wherever they are.
That's fantastic. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I thoroughly enjoyed meeting you here today, because it's clear that you have a passion for your subject, but by the same token, your passion didn't get in the way of your storytelling. And sometimes people's passion ends up to be very academic feeling and very, I'm going to tell you about this, but instead your character's telling the story and you're shepherding her along the way. And it's an art to be able to do that, especially on a debut novel, because many times people just get caught in the weeds. And you can see where they got caught in the weeds, and I never felt that for a moment.
Thank you very much.
So, well, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it. We want to see what you're going to do next, and we hope you're back to talk to us again about it the next time, whenever that is, about whatever it is. So thank you.
Thank you.
And to everyone else, look forward to seeing you next time. And don't forget, Bronte's Mistress, my latest bets on selection. Thanks for joining us.